Bienvenidos al Encuentros del Futuro. We're here to have a conversation about the peace process in Colombia. Most of you will know that a plebiscite took place 4 months ago in which President Santos put a peace agreement to the Colombian people. It was defeated, but 2.5 months later, he got a new peace agreement through Congress. We will talk about that in just a moment, but we're here with Maria Jimena Guzman, an author and journalist, and Frank Pearl, who has spent 7 years at the very heart of the peace talks in that country. But I want to start back in the 80s and 90s, because a lot of the discussions around the peace process have focused on FARC. But given how popular Narcos has been, I thought it would be good to have a conversation about a different period in Colombian history when there were multiple threats to the state, not both, but including the narco cartels, left-wing guerrilla groups, right-wing paramilitaries, and a threat to the state from within the state because it was so corrupted. And watching Narcos, although we have to remember that it's fiction, but it did present a real and present danger. And Maria, I just wonder if you could remind us of what Colombia at that time was like when it was most fragile and the Cali and Medellin cartels were killing presidential candidates, corrupting judges, killing journalists, starting the process of kidnapping that would eventually bring the Colombian government close to its knees.
Well, yes, back in the 80s, Colombia was facing many challenges or threats, I would say. First one, in terms of the guerrilla, the leftist guerrilla groups, we were having like 6 movements, illegal guerrilla movements, all sponsored by different, groups, international groups. So that was ELN, that was backed by Fidel Castro's regime. EPL, which was backed by the Chinese. M19, which was backed by the Cubans as well, it was a nationalist guerrilla, and as well Las FARC, which was a Soviet-backed guerrilla, which was amazing for that moment. That time of the world was, I think the only guerrilla that was still alive and strong, and he was backed by the Soviet Union. So, and among others, that there were so little that we can remember the names, but we had much more guerrilla leftist movements than political parties. On the other hand, we would have a huge cartel that we started to call it the Medellin cartel, because it was headed by somebody that was member at that time of the parliament, of the Congress in Colombia. His name was Pablo Escobar.
I've heard of him.
Have you heard about? Well, Pablo Escobar decided to, in a way, climb up the ladder and fulfill his will of power using the money of drug business. And he was about to succeed when we at El Espectador decided to run a story after ages, after months of trying to see if that person that was we saw at that moment in the government, in the parliament, was in a way part of a racketeer movement of a racketeer action that was held on 1976 on drug charges. And apparently we didn't find the photograph because Guillermo Cano at that moment, he was the head of the El Espectador, decided that this guy had this terrible past, but we haven't been able to really acknowledge if that past was true. So we kept on looking that photograph. In Colombia, whenever you go into jail, you have this photograph taken. So he remembered that photograph of Pablo Escobar going into jail. 1976, I mean, it was amazing. Well, we finally end up, we found the photograph, we found the story, and we found that in 1976 he was held into custody on drug charges. And
So that
apparently,
part of Narcos is true, because I remember
yeah,
that scene.
that was true, but that was about the only thing that's true. I would tell you the truth. But anyhow, but after that, we run the story immediately. When we run the story, we thought that we were going into, with this scoop, amazing scoop, but we didn't know that what was going to happen to us. And after that, week after, President Betancourt decided to start out the way of taking out his, how do you call that, his, at that time, if you wanted to get into trial, to go into trial somebody that was part of the Congress, you would have to take out sort of a special way that you have to, I don't know how how do you call that? I can recall the. No, I just can't recall how they can. It was in terms of no. God. In order to bring a member of a parliament into justice, you would have to renounce to
immunity.
Yeah, okay.
To immunity. So, somehow in a week or so, the parliament decided to vote against immunity. Mm-hmm. So Pablo Escobar lost the immunity and was exposed. And so he went into, he went out from the Congress, and he went to hiding ever since.
Yeah.
So at that time, Pablo Escobar became clandestine. Mm. And at that time, Pablo Escobar became, that was 1985.
1985, so he lived a clandestine life between 85 and his death in the early 90s. But prior to that, he was openly
he was member of the
operating.
Congress.
How did he manage, Frank, to get elected? I mean, because it was only 10 years previously that he was done for drug charges, and how did it take a photograph to be published in El Espectador for people to go, oh yeah, he really was involved in drugs? I mean, I can't understand how that wouldn't have been present knowledge at the time when he ran for Congress. I mean,
well, at that time, as Maria Jimena was saying, our state was more fragile than the one we have today, and it wasn't able to reach out to solve people's needs. So if you were a politician with a large checkbook, you could, buy out votes. And that's the way they did it, either through benefits, building houses for people, or providing economic, tangible benefits for people, or buying votes, or by coercion. So it's a mixture of mechanisms. But the fact and the matter was that he was a drug dealer, and he was in Congress.
Well, we're on the subject of drugs, Maria, and Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel weren't the only people who were involved in drugs. Depending on who you speak to in Colombia, the FARC were either the biggest cartel in the country, or by their own admission, they taxed the cartels and they allowed them safe passage through areas where coca was growing. What's your estimation of FARC's involvement in drugs? Because they had to get the money from somewhere to support the war once the Soviet Union had disbanded.
No, I think that the relationship was very near from the beginning. Back in the 80s, the FARC was used by the drug dealers, especially by the cartel de Medellin, which was the powerful cartel, to protect their businesses down the south, in the middle of the jungle, in which the big laboratories were created and where all the stuff of the drug was processed. So they have this kind of relationship, being bodyguards of all the laboratories, of coca laboratories in the south of Colombia, in the Yari region, in which right now the FARC, has strongholds up to now. So I think that started, as a former, as a relationship, partner relationship between two illegal bodies, you see. But as the time passed by and, things changed, it really ended up being a turf territory. battle. It was, a matter of who owns a territory and who is the one who governed the territory. And since there was no state presence in those territories, this turf territory took place for the last, 35 years. And in some places, the FARC won, and in some places, the paramilitary won. But the drug dealers, made a huge, make a huge difference in terms of that battle, because they decided to hook up with the strongholds of with the landlords in the local areas, with certain members of the military ranking officers in the regionals. And they hooked up this illegal army sponsored by the drug dealers, especially by the Medellin cartel. Persons like Gacha, I don't know if it appears in Narcos, but
he
Gacha,
does. Yes, he does.
Gacha, the Mexicano, built these amazing illegal armies. So they were the first narco paramilitary squads who really were the ones who hit the FARC that were at that moment very powerful in certain regions of Colombia.
And Frank, we were talking earlier about the impact which drugs still has in Colombia, and the peace agreement has been signed and it's beginning to be implemented, but it would be a mistake to think that the peace agreement is going to solve all Colombia's problems. And talk to us about how significant the problem of drugs is and will remain once peace hopefully takes hold.
Yeah, there is a very important difference between the end of the conflict and real and lasting peace. And we've achieved the end of the conflict with FARC. But the challenge and the opportunity now for us is to achieve real peace. Narco traffic is a very significant challenge that we do have. The size and the length of illegal crops has grown in the last few years. Government now has a goal to decrease the number of hectares by 100,000 only in this year. Those hectares are planted in regions in which we do not have state. So you need a combination of things. You need to have contention measures, which have to do with force and justice, but you also have to have prevention measures. And that is the area in which we are lacking a long-term vision. Why? Because we do not have social investment programs in those regions that generate skills and capacities in people, so there's lack of opportunities. I worked with a team a few years ago in which we reviewed 500 social programs in different regions of the country. And we try to analyze, even considering age groups, which of those programs really were able to generate new skills in children, teenagers, and young adults. Almost none. Why is so? Because governments have a term of 4 years. They need to communicate the results on a yearly basis. And you cannot achieve permanent changes with short-term programs. So what we need is a national consensus so that social investment, especially in those regions, especially in children, women, teenagers, and young adults, have a content that is long-term based, so you can generate those capacities so that people not only have more opportunities, but they're able to generate opportunities for themselves. So long-term, justice and force, but long-term, effective, transparent social investment. That is the way.
And you go ahead.
I would just go with the line of yours. I would say that the relationship between drugs and FARC changes when the Cold War ended. Cold War ended, and the FARC started out with different kind of relationship with the drugs, with
Because they're
crops.
funding from the Soviet
They
Union.
were not anymore,
Disappeared.
protecting
Yeah.
landowners of, or crops or big drug dealers. Or they started to go in deep into the business, and to what extent they had arrived. It all depends on which region
Yes.
are you talking about. I don't think las FARC it's as, as you said.
Well, I was quoting a senior military
the
figure, not
cartel,
me.
but I do think that they have amounts of money coming from that business, and that the basis of, the structures of las FARC are deeply embedded into the business of the drug illicit business. So I think that's one of the reasons the FARC decided to go and to go and sit with Frank Pearl in La Habana, and among others, delegates in Colombia of President Santos' government. I think that they acknowledged that if they kept on doing things, on living as they were living, they would have to become, part of the cartel.
Which might mean that they would eventually end up in a supermax prison in America.
A completely different kind of job that, would be, if you still are, guerrillero kind of, guerrillero of the 60s, which was...
I'm sorry. No, and what we did in the peace agreements is we acknowledged the fact that narco-trafficking has been an important part of FARC's activity. It's been key in their funding. We will not solve all the drug issues in Colombia through the peace process, but there's clear agreements and commitments on their part. First, they need to renounce to every link to any criminal or illegal organization related to drug dealing. Second, they need to provide complete and full information linked to the value chain of that business. And thirdly, they need to provide an inventory of their assets in order to repair victims materially. Will they do it? It's yet to be seen. If they do it, it'll contribute enormously to our fighting in terms of decreasing the drugs issue. If they don't, that will be their trap. Because if they don't, they cannot be fooled. The justice system, either the Colombian justice system or other justice system, will go after them, and if they don't comply, they will end up like former paramilitary
How
commanders.
long have they got to deliver that information? Is it 6 months or is it a little bit longer?
They have to do it start now. From now on, they have to start it,
As the transitional justice systems and tribunals are set up, and they comply to those tribunals, they will have to comply with the full truth.
So maybe just explain very briefly transitional justice, the idea that if the FARC come clean, they get lesser sentences, and if they don't, they're going to be open to conventional justice. Just explain briefly for people who...
So what we did is we set up the victims at the center of the agreement so that their rights could be reestablished, if you will, if that's possible. So there's 3 roads, all of them based on the principle of the full truth. If a FARC commander that is responsible for crimes against humanity, which will not have amnesty, complies to the tribunals and complies with the complete truth, including material reparation to victims, that person will pay a sentence of social work between 5 and 8 years. Let's say you were planting mines during the last 15 years, you will have to do demining in different regions of the country for 8 years. Second road. You tell the truth, but it's not complete, and then you complete the truth during the trials. You will then go to prison for 5 to 8 years. Third road, you don't comply to the truth at all, you go to prison from 15 to 20 years. That's the agreement.
Yeah, well, I think that in order for us to explain what happened in terms of challenges of the, of the threats against this Colombian state back in the 80s, big threat was this Pablo Escobar cartel, which was really threatening not Colombians, threatening the whole nation. I mean, he was wanting to to rule the country. He was really wanting to be part of the power. So that was the big threat. Okay, when we destroyed, or we don't, but the forces, the military forces and the police forces destroyed him and killed him, you know, we said, all Colombians, well, we're finished. Medellin cartel, it's over, you know. Well, we can start over, you know, be a different country. But, you know, and at the very, you know, minute that we were mourning Pablo Escobar, the Cali cartel emerged. Cali cartel was quite different. Cali cartel didn't hook up with the right in order to cope with this war against the guerrillas. They decided to buy the society, to corrupt officials, not to kill them,
So they were much more kind of under the radar.
Yeah, they decided there was the second generation, and it was like, you know, the second generation in New York.
Yeah.
So they were kind of, you know, not wanting to kill people, but to buy out people. So that happens. But then, again, all the forces, you know, hooked up with this amazing effort, and with the Americans and whatever, and British intelligence, and after 4 years, we end up dismantling Cali cartel. So again, we said, wow,
Job done.
Job done. We can start over. But what happened was that at that time, the big challenge was that we had a huge number of an illegal army, you know, that was sponsored by this drug dealers that had become the paramilitary squad, that had that had lots of territory and controlled territory, and that was going to, that was waging out a war against Las FARC. And although it was very aware, the Colombian people, that was happening, nobody couldn't stop what was going on, and almost, I think I would say, the last 20 years, you know, in the 90s, that was the word that was held. And after 70 massacres, and after many, that was the moment in which the Colombians died the most. And after 20 years, I would say, we end up in this peace process with President Pastrana, and at that very moment, it was impossible to achieve a peace process with Las FARC, because Las FARC was was empowered, was doing operations with 1,000 of guerrilla members, you know, which was amazing. It was a miracle. And on the other side, the paramilitaries were conquering this country and completely changing the land owner, and it was changing everything. So we arrived, you know, back in at the end of the 90s, Colombia was in the midst of no state and under siege, because the state couldn't handle nor the guerrilla nor the paramilitary squads.
So at that point, 2002, President Uribe is elected, partly because the Pastrana peace talks had failed, and the country, I think, voted for security. Talk to us a bit about those 8 years and the impact that the President Uribe's government, which you're a part of, had.
You know, I think it's also important to recognize and acknowledge the fact that once the Caguán peace process failed, President Pastrana started a process of strengthening the military forces. So he, with Ambassador Moreno, agreed with the U.S. the Plan Colombia. Important funding to strengthen our military forces, intelligence, and police, and they began the operations, which, of course, were increased during the 8 years of President Uribe. When President Uribe took office, FARC had direct or indirect presence, together with the paramilitary groups, in around 400 to 450 municipalities in Colombia. That's like almost 45% of our municipalities. Now, as we signed the peace process, had FARC had only important presence in about 36 municipalities. That's because President Uribe used the strength of the state, and President Santos continued that even when the peace process was public and was advanced in its first 2 years. So the situation now is different, but going back to your first point, our main challenge in terms of security today is narco-traffic. It has increased. We have acknowledged that. There's a plan to decrease it, but we will only be able to gain or win that battle, if you will, if we do two things. We have to have a dialogue with the international community, because the war against drugs needs to be reviewed in its content. The way we've conducted has created distortions that are political, social, and economic, bringing more risks to those populations that are affected by that activity in the regions. So we need to rethink our policy against drugs. While we do that, again, effective social investment, so that no children or teenager thinks my future is in the drug business. I have a better future within legality. That's the alternative that we have to provide to the young generation of Colombians.
I think always that I have reached to a point in which I think that narco-trafficking has always exacerbated our weaknesses as Colombians, as the Colombian state. And because every time we accomplish something, we have been the country most successful in dismantling cartels, but we still have tons of problems in terms of crop growing and per hectares, but as well in terms of consuming and processing. Why is it happening? Because we have, as you have said, set up lots of programs, social programs, because we have a lack. We lack of. This Colombian state hasn't been able to really have a presence in all the Colombian soil. Historically speaking, we are not a nation. We're still in the making, you see. And that's our great and most difficult challenge. If we don't do something in terms to change that weakness, I think we will not succeed in trying to change what you cannot change. Even if we change as well the policies against drugs, that we have to. But if we don't change internally speaking in Colombia, we will still have problems, and we will still be the first processing country in the world.
When you say change, do you mean that the Colombian state needs to be in control of the soil in virtually all of the country, as is the case in most as it were, normal countries?
You go outside the boundaries of Bogota, and you just don't feel the state presence. I mean, you don't even see a bank. You see,
how far? 2 hours, 3 hours?
3 hours, 4 hours. You in 4 hours you are in the middle of a stronghold of Las FARC, which is called in Ibagué.
And are there schools in that area?
Yes, provided by Las FARC.
Right. And doctor surgeries.
Doctors provided by Las FARC. So in just 4 hours from Bogota.
And what happens?
So I don't know. And other places will be provided by the paramilitary squads.
But in a year's time, FARC won't be allowed to hold territory and provide schools and
But
doctors.
as well, something, they have to bring as well justice. I mean, institutions, democratic institutions.
Yeah.
So if we don't reach with, we don't reach those peoples, those regions, with democratic institutions, with justice, with social policies, with programs, we won't be able to really become a nation. And in order to cope with the big challenges we have to face.
But those democratic institutions, when the state hopefully gets into those regions and does more than just provide schools, but it provides a system of government, talk briefly, Frank, about the challenge. We've talked about drugs, the challenge from corruption, because you could bring local government into that area and it might have no relationship with the central government of Bogota and it might be corrupted, but just briefly.
We have a decentralized system since the Constitution of 1991. And there's a tremendous gap between the effectiveness of central government and the effectiveness of little local governments in those regions. So I think we need to change two things. The way mayors can decide over the use of soil, which is the most important source of corruption today, and the rules of engagement for local budgets. If we did that, engaging the community with some controls, we might be able to create a new, it takes time, political and administrative, let's say, class that will more effectively manage public resources in those regions.
Frank Pearl and Maria Jimena Duzman, many thanks for this conversation about the Proceso del Paz in Colombia. Muchas gracias desde Encuentros del Futuro, and until we meet each other again, many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.